Sometimes the peace we think we've built is just a roof over buried secrets. For Ruth Coleman, 52 years old and living alone with her faithful dog Scout, the quiet mountain cabin was supposed to be her sanctuary from a world that had taken too much from her. She thought she knew every rock and root on her 20 acres. After 15 years in these Colorado mountains, Ruth had walked every trail and weathered every storm. Her days followed a simple rhythm: morning coffee on the porch, afternoon hikes with Scout, evenings by the fireplace. But when the biggest storm in decades ripped through the valley, it exposed something that had been hidden for over 30 years. Scout wouldn't stop digging at a rusted metal hatch buried beneath the old pine tree. What Ruth found in that underground bunker would connect her to a family, secret she never knew existed. What was her grandfather really doing in these mountains all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered in the crisp mountain air like an unfinished conversation. Ruth Coleman stood on her covered porch, steam rising from her ceramic mug as she surveyed the damage across her 20 acres. Pine boughs lay scattered like discarded thoughts, and the creek that normally whispered its way down the mountainside now rushed with an urgency that made Scout's ears perk up from his usual spot beside her rocking chair. At 52, Ruth had learned to appreciate the way morning light painted the peaks in shades of gold and amber. 5 years had passed since she'd fled to these Colorado mountains, carrying nothing but grief and a German shepherd puppy that had somehow understood her need for silence. The cabin she'd chosen sat at 7,000 feet, far enough from civilization that she could hear her own thoughts again, yet close enough to the small town of Cedar Falls that she could drive down for supplies when necessary. The log structure itself told a story of careful craftsmanship. Her grandfather had built it in 1962, though Ruth had never understood why he'd chosen such an isolated location. The thick pine logs bore the scars of decades of mountain weather, yet the foundation remained solid, or had, until last night's storm revealed something that made her question everything she thought she knew about this place. Scout, now 5 years old and grown into the kind of loyal companion that made conversations unnecessary, had been acting strangely since the storm passed. His usual morning routine of checking the perimeter had been replaced by persistent attention to the area near the old pine tree that stood sentinel behind the cabin. The massive tree, easily a century old, had always been Ruth's favorite feature of the property. She'd spent countless evenings reading beneath its spreading branches, feeling connected to something larger than her own small sorrows. But now, Scout sat perfectly still beside that tree, his brown eyes fixed on a section of disturbed earth where the storm had washed away decades of accumulated soil and pine needles. Ruth had noticed it yesterday evening when she'd first stepped outside to assess the damage, but she'd been too tired and too focused on checking for structural problems to investigate further. This morning, however, the sight of Scout's intense concentration drew her down the porch steps and across the wet grass. The air still held the scent of rain and ozone, mixed with the eternal fragrance of pine and mountain sage that had become as familiar to Ruth as her own breathing. Her boots squelched in the saturated earth as she approached the spot that had captured Scout's attention. What she saw made her pause. The storm's runoff had carved a small channel along the base of the pine tree, exposing what appeared to be worked stone, not the natural granite that characterized the rest of the mountain, but cut blocks that spoke of human intention. The cornerstone bore the faint outline of numbers, too weathered to read clearly, but definitely carved by human hands. "What do you think, boy?" Ruth asked, crouching beside Scout and running her fingers along the exposed stone. "Grandpa never mentioned building anything else out here," Scout responded with a soft whine, the kind he usually reserved for moments when he sensed something important that Ruth hadn't yet understood. His nose worked the air above the stone, and Ruth noticed his tail wasn't wagging with his typical enthusiasm. Instead, He sat with the alertness of a dog who'd discovered something that required careful attention. Ruth's memories of her grandfather remained vivid despite the decades that had passed since his death. Frank Morrison had been a quiet man, with steady hands and thoughtful eyes, the kind of person who spoke carefully and meant every word. He'd built this cabin as his retirement project, though Ruth had never understood why he'd chosen such isolation after a lifetime of work she'd never quite comprehended. Her parents had always been vague about his career, saying only that he'd worked for the government and traveled frequently. The cabin itself reflected his methodical nature. Every log had been precisely fitted, every joint carefully crafted to withstand the mountain's harsh winters. The stone fireplace dominated the main room, built with rocks he'd gathered from the mountainside and mortared with a skill that spoke of serious study. The kitchen, though small, contained everything necessary for comfortable living, and the bedroom loft, accessed by a sturdy wooden ladder, provided views of the entire valley. Ruth had inherited the property when she was 37, just 2 years before David's accident changed everything. At the time, she and her husband had talked about using it as a vacation retreat, a place to escape the demands of their busy lives in Denver. David had been an architect with a practice that kept him working 60-hour weeks, while Ruth managed the business side of their small firm. They'd had plans, so many plans, for lazy weekends in the mountains, for hiking trails and reading books by the fire. But plans, Ruth had learned, were fragile things that shattered as easily as safety glass on a dark highway. After the funeral, after the insurance settlements and the sale of their Denver home, Ruth had come to the mountains with nothing but Scout and a pickup truck full of belongings that no longer seemed to matter. The solitude that might have felt overwhelming to someone else had wrapped around her like a comfortable blanket. Here, she could grieve without explanation, could spend entire days without speaking to another human being, could begin the slow process of rebuilding herself around the hollow space where her future used to be. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down the mountain road, Maria Santos, who ran the small general store that served the scattered community of families who'd chosen similar isolation. Maria was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of practical wisdom that came from decades of mountain living. She'd made it clear that Ruth was welcome to drop by whenever she needed company, but she'd never pressed for more connection than Ruth was ready to offer. It was Maria who'd told Ruth the stories about the area's history, about the mining claims that had brought the first settlers to these mountains in the 1880s, about the families who'd come seeking different kinds of fortune, some finding gold, others finding the kind of peace that only came from living close to the sky. Maria's own family had homesteaded in the valley in 1923, and she possessed the kind of deep knowledge about the land that only came from generations of careful observation. Ruth had found comfort in these stories, in the idea that she was part of a long tradition of people who'd come to the mountains seeking something they couldn't find elsewhere. But she'd never asked Maria specifically about her grandfather's time here, perhaps because she'd been afraid that learning too much about his life might somehow diminish the peace she'd found in his gift to her. Now, though, looking at the exposed stone foundation that Scout had discovered, Ruth felt the stirring of questions she'd never thought to ask. She stood up, brushing dirt from her hands, and made a mental note to drive down to Maria's store later in the week. It was time to learn more about the history of this place that had become her sanctuary. The morning routine continued with the familiar rhythm that had sustained Ruth through 5 years of mountain living. She fed Scout, started a load of laundry, and spent an hour clearing the smaller storm debris from around the cabin. The work felt good, the kind of physical activity that kept both body and mind occupied without requiring the emotional energy that more complex tasks demanded. By noon, the sun had burned off the morning clouds, revealing the kind of crystalline blue sky that made Ruth remember why she'd fallen in love with this altitude. The air at 7,000 feet carried a clarity that seemed to rinse away the accumulated weight of smaller worries, leaving room for the bigger questions that mattered. It was while she was stacking the cleared pine boughs beside the woodshed that Scout's behavior shifted from alert interest to something approaching urgency. He'd returned to the spot beneath the pine tree, but now he was digging, not the casual investigation of a curious dog, but the focused excavation of an animal who'd detected something significant beneath the surface. "Scout, what's gotten into you?" Ruth called, but the German shepherd ignored her in a way that was completely unlike his usual responsive nature. Instead, he dug with the kind of intensity she'd only seen when he'd cornered a prairie dog or detected the scent of elk nearby. Ruth approached the tree again, this time noticing details she'd missed during her morning examination. The exposed stone wasn't just a foundation corner. It was part of a larger structure that extended beneath the pine tree's root system. Scout's digging had revealed the edge of what appeared to be a metal surface, dark with rust but unmistakably man-made. The discovery sent a chill through Ruth that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She'd been living on this property for 5 years, had walked past this tree thousands of times, had even used its trunk as a backrest during countless evening reading sessions. The idea that something significant lay buried beneath it felt like learning that a trusted friend had been keeping secrets. She knelt beside Scout and helped him clear away more of the loose soil and pine needles. What emerged was the edge of a metal hatch, perhaps 3 feet square, set flush with what appeared to be a concrete collar. The metal bore the deep rust of decades of exposure, but the surface was too regular, too purposeful, to be anything other than intentional construction. Ruth sat back on her heels, her heart beginning to beat with a rhythm that reminded her of the moments before David's accident, when normal life was about to transform into something unrecognizable. Scout continued digging around the edges of the hatch, and Ruth could see that it wasn't just embedded in the earth. It was part of a structure that extended beneath the surface. The afternoon sun slanted through the pine branches, casting moving shadows across the exposed metal. Ruth found herself thinking about her grandfather's funeral, held on a grey October day when she was 12 years old. She remembered the service, remembered the military honors that had seemed important to the adults but meant nothing to her at the time. But more clearly, she remembered the weeks that followed, when strange men in dark suits had come to the house asking questions about Frank Morrison's papers, his belongings, his habits. Her parents had been nervous during those visits in a way that 12-year-old Ruth hadn't understood. The men had been polite but persistent, and they'd left with several boxes of her grandfather's belongings, things that Ruth's father had claimed were just old work files that needed to be returned to the government. Now, 30 years later, Ruth wondered what else her grandfather might have left behind. What other secrets might be buried in the mountain soil that had become her refuge? The exposed hatch seemed to pulse with possibility, with the promise of answers to questions she'd never known to ask. Scout had stopped digging and now sat beside the hatch with the patient alertness of a dog who'd completed his assigned task. His brown eyes met Ruth's, and she could swear she saw something like expectation in his expression, as if he'd been waiting for this moment as long as she had. The shadows were lengthening across the mountainside when Ruth finally stood up, her knees stiff from crouching. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find a way to open whatever lay beneath the pine tree. Tonight, she would call her sister Linda in California, the only family member who might remember more about their grandfather's life than Ruth had ever learned. As she walked back toward the cabin with Scout padding beside her, Ruth felt the weight of change settling over her mountain sanctuary, like a weather front moving in from the western peaks. Whatever lay buried beneath that hatch had been hidden for decades, waiting for the right storm to expose it, waiting for the right person to find it. Ruth suspected that person was meant to be her. The phone call to Linda lasted nearly 2 hours, though the first hour consisted mostly of catching up on family news and carefully approaching the subject that had prompted Ruth to dial her sister's number. Linda lived in Sacramento with her husband and teenage children, maintaining the kind of busy, suburban life that Ruth had abandoned after David's death. The sisters spoke monthly, but their conversations usually focused on Linda's family activities and Ruth's updates about mountain weather and Scout's latest adventures. This time, however, Ruth needed something different. "I've been thinking about Grandpa Frank lately," Ruth said when the conversation reached a natural pause. "Do you remember much about his time in Colorado? About why he built the cabin?" Linda's response came after a moment of silence that felt longer than it probably was. "You know, Mom and Dad never really talked about that period of his life. I always assumed it was just where he wanted to retire. You know how he loved the outdoors. Do you remember those men who came to the house after his funeral? The ones in the suits?" Another pause. "I was only 8, Ruth. I remember them being there, but I don't remember what they wanted." "Why are you asking about this now?" Ruth found herself hesitating, unsure how to explain the discovery beneath the pine tree without sounding like she'd spent too many years alone in the mountains. "I found something on the property, something that suggests there might be more to his story than we knew." The conversation that followed revealed how little either sister actually knew about their grandfather's working life. Linda remembered him as a quiet man who traveled frequently, who always brought them small gifts from places they'd never heard of, who seemed to possess knowledge about subjects that never came up in normal family conversation. But the specifics of his career, the nature of his government work, the reasons for his choices, those details had been carefully kept from the grandchildren, and apparently from their parents as well. By the time Ruth hung up, she felt more curious than ever about the metal hatch waiting beneath the pine tree. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made every detail of the landscape appear etched against the sky. Ruth had spent a restless night thinking about her grandfather, about the stories he'd never told, about the possibility that her peaceful mountain sanctuary held secrets she'd never imagined. Scout seemed to understand that today would be different. Instead of his usual casual morning exploration of the property, he led Ruth directly to the pine tree and sat beside the exposed hatch with the patience of a dog who knew. Important work lay ahead. Ruth had spent the previous evening gathering tools from her grandfather's workshop, a crowbar, a hammer, a set of wrenches that looked like they hadn't been used in decades. The workshop itself, attached to the back of the cabin, felt like a museum of careful craftsmanship. Every tool had its designated place, every surface bore the patina of regular use, and the whole space carried the lingering scent of motor oil and pine sawdust that reminded Ruth of her grandfather's hands. Now, kneeling beside the hatch with Scout watching intently, Ruth began the careful process of investigating what her grandfather had left behind. The metal surface was heavily rusted, but she could make out what appeared to be a locking mechanism along one edge. Not a simple latch, but something more complex that suggested whatever lay beneath had been meant to stay hidden. The numbers she'd noticed on the cornerstone became clearer as she brushed away more accumulated debris. 1962 was carved into the stone, along with what looked like a series of letters and numbers that meant nothing to Ruth but suggested some kind of official designation. As she worked to clear the debris from around the hatch, Ruth began to notice other details that spoke of careful planning and construction. The concrete collar that held the hatch was precisely poured, with drain channels that would direct water away from whatever lay beneath. The hinges, though rusted, were heavy-duty hardware designed to support significant weight. This wasn't the kind of casual construction project that someone undertook on a weekend. It was the work of someone who knew exactly what they were building and why. The crowbar proved essential for breaking the rust that had essentially welded the hatch closed over the decades. Ruth worked patiently, applying pressure at different points along the edge, feeling the metal give way gradually as the seal broke. Scout remained beside her throughout the process, his ears forward and his attention focused on the hatch as if he could sense something she couldn't. When the hatch finally gave way, with a metallic groan that echoed off the mountainside, Ruth found herself looking down into darkness that smelled of old air and something else, something chemical and sharp that made her instinctively step back. A ladder, constructed of the same heavy-duty metal as the hatch, descended into the shadows. Ruth retrieved a flashlight from the cabin and returned to find Scout peering into the opening with the intense curiosity of a dog who'd discovered something that required investigation. The beam of light revealed a chamber that extended much farther than Ruth had expected. What she could see suggested a space that had been carefully constructed and furnished, not just a simple root cellar or storage area. The walls appeared to be lined with some kind of metal sheeting, and she could make out what looked like equipment or furniture in the shadows beyond the reach of her flashlight. "Well, Scout," Ruth said, her voice sounding strange in the mountain air, "I guess we're going to find out what Grandpa was really doing up here." The descent into the chamber felt like traveling backward through time. Each step down the metal ladder took Ruth farther from the familiar world of her mountain sanctuary and deeper into a reality she'd never imagined. The air grew cooler as she descended, and the chemical smell became stronger. Not unpleasant, exactly, but definitely artificial in a way that seemed out of place. In the middle of the wilderness, Scout followed her down the ladder, with the careful precision of a dog who understood that this expedition required serious attention. When they reached the bottom, Ruth's flashlight revealed a space that left her momentarily speechless. The chamber was larger than her cabin's main room, with a ceiling high enough that she could stand comfortably. But it was the contents of the space that made her understand she'd stepped into something far more significant than a simple family secret. The walls were lined with equipment that looked like it belonged in a laboratory or research facility. Tables held instruments she couldn't identify, their dials and gauges catching the light from her flashlight in ways that suggested precision engineering. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their metal surfaces bearing the same kind of official labels she'd noticed on the hatch. A desk in one corner held papers and books, protected by what appeared to be a plastic covering that had kept them dry despite the decades, but it was the device in the center of the room that captured Ruth's attention and sent a chill of recognition through her memory. The machine looked like something from a science fiction movie, with a rectangular box connected to a wand-like probe by a thick cable. Even in the shadows, Ruth could make out the dial, face, and the distinctive design that reminded her of pictures she'd seen in history books. It was a Geiger counter, a device for measuring radiation. The realization hit Ruth with the force of a physical blow. Her grandfather hadn't just built a cabin in the mountains for his retirement. He'd built a monitoring station, a place where he could conduct some kind of research or surveillance that required sophisticated equipment and absolute secrecy. Scout whined softly beside her, and Ruth realized she'd been standing motionless for several minutes, trying to process what she was seeing. The chamber felt like a time capsule from a different era, when the Cold War made secrets a way of life, and ordinary citizens might find themselves involved in extraordinary circumstances. Moving carefully through the space, Ruth began to understand the scope of what her grandfather had created. The filing cabinets contained maps, dozens of them, showing the local area with notations and markings that suggested systematic observation over many years. The desk held journals filled with her grandfather's careful handwriting, recording measurements and observations that meant nothing to Ruth, but clearly had great significance to him. One journal lay open, as if her grandfather had been working at the desk when he'd last visited this hidden chamber. The entries were dated from the early 1980s, just a few years before his death, and they recorded something called background levels at various locations throughout the valley. The numbers meant nothing to Ruth, but the fact that her grandfather had been taking regular measurements of something in the area for decades suggested a level of concern that no one in the family had ever suspected. The Geiger counter itself appeared to be in working condition, despite the years it had spent in the underground chamber. When Ruth located what appeared to be a power switch and pressed it, the device came to life with a series of clicks that made Scout's ears perk up with alarm. The dial face glowed with a faint green light, and the needle moved to a position that Ruth assumed indicated normal background radiation. But as she moved the probe around the chamber, the clicking increased, and the needle moved higher on the dial. Ruth didn't understand the specific measurements, but the device's response suggested that even down here, in this carefully constructed bunker, radiation levels were elevated above what the machine considered normal. The implications of that discovery sent Ruth's mind racing through possibilities that ranged from the merely concerning to the genuinely frightening. Her grandfather had been monitoring radiation in the area for decades, which meant there was a source of radiation somewhere nearby. The government men who'd come after his funeral had been interested in his records, which suggested that whatever he'd been documenting was considered sensitive information, and Ruth had been living on this property for 5 years, drinking water from the well, growing vegetables in the garden, breathing air that might be carrying radioactive particles from some unknown source. As she explored the chamber more thoroughly, Ruth found evidence that her grandfather's monitoring hadn't been a casual hobby. The maps were professionally drafted, the equipment was sophisticated and expensive, and the journals contained the kind of detailed observations that suggested someone who understood exactly what he was looking for and why it mattered. But perhaps most disturbing was the collection of photographs she found in one of the filing cabinets. Black and white images showed the area around the cabin and the broader valley, but they also showed things Ruth had never seen: construction sites, men in protective suits, vehicles that looked military in nature. The photographs were dated from the 1960s and early 1970s, and they painted a picture of significant activity in the area during a period when Ruth had assumed the mountains were largely uninhabited. One photograph in particular caught her attention, an aerial shot of the valley that showed what appeared to be a large excavation site about 2 miles from her cabin, in an area she'd hiked through dozens of times without seeing any evidence of previous human activity. The excavation looked substantial, the kind of operation that would have required heavy equipment and many workers. Yet Ruth had never seen any evidence that such activity had ever taken place. The longer she spent in the chamber, the more questions multiplied in Ruth's mind. What had been excavated in the valley? Why had her grandfather been monitoring radiation levels? What had the government been so interested in after his death? And perhaps most immediately important, was she safe living here? Scout had remained close to her throughout the exploration, but now he began to whine in a way that suggested he was ready to return to the surface. Ruth realized she'd been underground for nearly 3 hours, absorbed in trying to understand the scope of her grandfather's secret project. As she prepared to climb back up the ladder, Ruth made a decision that surprised her with its certainty. She would continue her grandfather's work, whatever it had been. The evidence suggested that something important was happening in the valley, something that required monitoring and documentation. Her grandfather had died before completing whatever mission he'd undertaken. But the equipment remained functional, the records were intact, and Ruth was the only person who knew the secret chamber existed. The climb back to the surface felt like emerging from a cave into a different world. The afternoon sun seemed brighter than it had before, the mountain air felt thinner, and the familiar landscape of her property looked subtly changed. As if she was seeing it through new eyes, Scout bounded away from the hatch opening with obvious relief. But Ruth found herself turning back to look at the entrance to her grandfather's hidden world. Tomorrow she would return with better lighting and more time to study the records he'd left behind. Tomorrow she would begin to understand what he'd been protecting and what she might need to protect now. But tonight she would call Maria Santos and ask some very careful questions about the history of the valley, about activities in the 1960s and 1970s, about anything unusual that long-time residents might remember. It was time to learn what everyone else knew about the secrets buried in her mountain sanctuary. Ruth's conversation with Maria Santos took place 3 days after her discovery of the bunker, in the comfortable clutter of Santos' general store. The building itself was a testament to mountain pragmatism, part grocery store, part hardware shop, part post office, and entirely essential to the scattered community that called this remote valley home. Maria had run the store for 35 years, inheriting it from her parents who'd established it in the 1950s to serve the mining families and ranchers who'd chosen to make their lives in the high country. The conversation began casually enough, with Ruth purchasing supplies and exchanging the kind of weather-related observations that constituted normal social interaction in a place where neighbors might be separated by miles of forest road. But Ruth had come with specific questions, and she found herself struggling to ask them without revealing too much about what she'd discovered beneath the pine tree. "Maria, you've been here longer than anyone," Ruth began, loading a bag of dog food into her cart. "I've been wondering about the area's history, particularly from the 1960s. Do you remember any unusual activity from that time period?" Maria's response was immediate and definitive. "Oh, the government years. That was before most folks understood what was really happening. But yes, there was plenty of unusual activity." The phrase "government years" sent a chill through Ruth that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. "What kind of government activity?" "Mining surveys, they called them," Maria said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who'd never quite believed the official explanation. "Men in suits driving government vehicles, asking questions about mineral rights and water sources. They were particularly interested in the area around your grandfather's property, actually." Ruth felt her heart rate increase, but she kept her voice carefully neutral. "My grandfather's property? Why that area specifically?" "Well, that's where the uranium deposits were concentrated. The government was very interested in uranium in those days. Had something to do with national security, they said. Your grandfather was one of the few property owners who refused to sell his mineral rights, which made him quite unpopular with certain officials." The word uranium hit Ruth like a physical blow. Suddenly, the Geiger counter in the bunker made perfect sense, as did her grandfather's decades of careful monitoring. He hadn't been conducting random research. He'd been tracking radioactive contamination from uranium mining operations that had taken place, practically on his doorstep, too. "You know what happened to the mining operations?" Ruth asked, trying to keep her voice casual despite the racing of her thoughts. "They shut down in the early 1970s, Maria replied, restocking canned goods as she talked. Officially, the deposits weren't as extensive as they'd hoped. Unofficially, there were problems. Environmental issues that the government preferred not to discuss publicly. Several families in the area had health problems during that period, unusual cancers and such. Some folks connected it to the mining, but you know how it is with government operations. Hard to get straight answers." Ruth spent another hour in the store, carefully extracting information without revealing the source of her interest. What she learned painted a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than she'd imagined. The uranium mining operations had been extensive, involving multiple sites throughout the valley. The work had been conducted under military supervision, with most of the actual mining done by contractors who'd been required to sign secrecy agreements. Local families had been told the work was related to national security and that asking questions was unpatriotic, but the most troubling information came when Maria mentioned the pattern of illnesses that had affected Valley residents during and after the mining period. "My own mother developed a rare blood cancer in 1973, Maria said, her voice quiet with old grief. She was only 52, healthy as a horse until that year. The doctors in Denver couldn't explain it, said they'd never seen that particular type of cancer in someone with no family history and no obvious exposure to carcinogens. Were there other similar cases?" Ruth asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. More than there should have been for a population this small. 3 families lost members to unusual cancers between 1972 and 1975. The Peterson family moved away after their oldest son developed leukemia at age 16. The Hendersons left after Mrs. Henderson's thyroid cancer. She was only 38. Ruth left the store with more questions than answers. but with a growing understanding of why her grandfather had felt compelled to monitor radiation levels in the valley. If uranium mining operations had contaminated the area, and if the government had covered up the environmental impact, then someone needed to document the ongoing effects. Her grandfather had taken on that responsibility, and his death had left the work unfinished. The drive back to the cabin gave Ruth time to process what she'd learned and to consider what she needed to do next. The bunker contained decades of her grandfather's careful documentation, but Ruth needed to understand what his measurements actually meant. She needed to know whether the contamination was ongoing, whether it posed a current threat to her own health and the health of other valley residents. That evening, Ruth returned to the bunker with a better flashlight and a notebook to record her own observations. The chamber felt less alien on her second visit, though no less significant. She spent several hours studying her grandfather's journals, trying to decode his system of measurements and notations. What emerged was a picture of systematic contamination that had never been fully addressed. Her grandfather's measurements showed elevated radiation levels at multiple sites throughout the valley, with the highest concentrations centered around areas that corresponded to the mining sites shown in the photographs. But more disturbing were the measurements from recent years, which suggested that contamination levels weren't decreasing as they should have been if the original source had been properly remediated. The Geiger counter itself became Ruth's introduction to understanding radiation measurement. Using her grandfather's notes as a guide, she learned to interpret the device's readings and to understand what constituted normal background radiation versus concerning elevation. When she took the portable unit outside and began testing around her property, the results confirmed her worst fears. The area around the well that supplied her drinking water showed radiation levels nearly 3 times normal background. The garden, where she'd been growing vegetables for 5 years, registered even higher readings. The creek that she'd assumed was the source of the purest water in Colorado was carrying radioactive particles down from the mountainside. Scout, who had remained her constant companion during these investigations, was also being exposed to radiation every day. The realization that she might have been poisoning both herself and her beloved dog for 5 years filled Ruth with a mixture of anger and fear that made her hands shake as she recorded the measurements. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came when Ruth expanded her testing to include areas beyond her immediate property. Following the maps in her grandfather's files, she visited several of the sites where mining operations had taken place. At each location, the Geiger counter confirmed ongoing contamination at levels that posed serious health risks to anyone who spent significant time in the area. The abandoned mining sites weren't properly marked or fenced. Hiking trails passed through contaminated zones without any warning signs. The creek that carried radioactive runoff eventually flowed into the reservoir that supplied water to Cedar Falls, the small town where Maria and hundreds of other families lived and raised their children. Ruth returned to the bunker that night with a growing sense of urgency and responsibility. Her grandfather had documented the problem, but he died before taking any action to warn the affected communities or force proper remediation. The government officials who'd collected his papers after his death had clearly had no intention of addressing the contamination they'd caused, which meant that Ruth was the only person who knew the full scope of the ongoing environmental disaster, and the only person in a position to do something about it. As she studied her grandfather's most recent entries, Ruth found evidence that he'd been preparing to take his documentation public. A letter, apparently never sent, was addressed to the Environmental Protection Agency and detailed his concerns about ongoing contamination in the valley. Another draft letter was addressed to the Denver Post, offering to provide evidence of government cover-up of environmental damage. But her grandfather had died before sending either letter, and his evidence had remained buried in the bunker for over a decade. During that time, Ruth and countless others had continued to be exposed to radiation. levels that posed serious long-term health risks. The anger that filled Ruth as she contemplated this situation was unlike anything she'd experienced since David's death. But this was different from grief. This was the clean, focused anger that came from discovering injustice that could still be corrected. Her grandfather had died before completing his mission to protect the valley's residents, but Ruth was very much alive, and she possessed all the evidence necessary to force accountability. The question was how to proceed. Simply taking the evidence to local authorities seemed insufficient. If the contamination had been covered up for decades, local officials were either complicit or powerless to address it. But Ruth's grandfather's files contained contact information for environmental scientists, investigative journalists, and federal officials who might be willing to listen. As she climbed out of the bunker for the second time that day, Ruth made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. She would continue her grandfather's work, but she wouldn't spend decades documenting a problem that needed immediate attention. She would find a way to expose the contamination and force the remediation that should have happened 40 years ago. Scout was waiting for her at the surface, his tail wagging with relief at her return to daylight. Looking at him in the gathering dusk, Ruth felt a surge of protective determination that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with this dog in the first place. Scout had trusted her to keep him safe, just as the other residents of the valley trusted that their government wouldn't allow them to be poisoned by the air they breathed and the water they drank. That trust had been betrayed decades ago, but it wasn't too late to honor it now. The contamination map spread across Ruth's kitchen table like a diagnosis of terminal illness. Each red mark indicated a radiation hotspot. Each notation in her grandfather's careful handwriting documented another piece of evidence that the valley she'd come to love was slowly poisoning everyone who called it home. The geological surveys showed uranium deposits extending far beyond what the official mining records had indicated, creating a web of contamination that reached into every watershed and soil system in the region. Ruth had spent 3 days studying the maps, cross-referencing them with property records and health department statistics that she'd requested from the county offices. What emerged was a pattern that should have been impossible to ignore, yet had remained hidden for over 40 years. The Hendricks family, who'd owned the ranch 5 miles downstream from her cabin, had lost 3 members to rare cancers between 1974 and 1978. The Morrison family, no relation to her grandfather, despite the shared surname, had moved away in 1975 after their daughter developed leukemia at age 12. The pattern repeated itself throughout the valley. Families struck by unusual illnesses, unexplained deaths, children who never lived to see adulthood. But what made Ruth's hands tremble as she traced the contamination patterns was the realization that the exposure wasn't limited to the mining period. Her grandfather's measurements showed that radiation levels had remained dangerously elevated for decades after the official operations ended. Whatever had been done to remediate the sites had been insufficient, leaving radioactive materials to continue leaching into groundwater and being carried downhill by every storm. The phone call to Linda had been more difficult than Ruth had anticipated. How do you tell your sister that the family property where you've been living might be slowly killing you? How do you explain that your grandfather, the quiet man who'd seemed to epitomize honest simplicity, had been keeping secrets that affected entire communities? Ruth, you're scaring me, Linda had said, after Ruth's careful explanation of what she'd discovered. Are you saying that Dad knew about this? That the whole family knew there was something dangerous about that property? I don't think Dad knew the specifics, Ruth replied, though she wasn't entirely certain. But I think he knew Grandpa was involved in something serious. Remember how nervous he got whenever those government men came around after the funeral? The conversation had revealed details that Ruth wished she'd thought to ask about years earlier. Linda remembered their father destroying papers after their grandfather's death, Not just old bills and personal correspondence, but entire file boxes that he'd burned in the backyard without explanation. She remembered their mother's relief when the government officials stopped coming around, as if a burden had been lifted from the family. Most significantly, Linda remembered family members who died young or from unusual illnesses. Their great-aunt, Catherine, who'd lived in the valley during the mining period and had died of a brain tumor at age 35. Their cousin Robert, who'd developed bone cancer as a teenager and had spent his final months in a Denver hospital, surrounded by doctors who couldn't explain why a healthy farm boy had been struck by such an aggressive disease. "Do you think that's why Grandpa was monitoring the radiation?" Linda had asked. "Because family members were getting sick?" Ruth had spent hours after that phone call thinking about her grandfather's motivations. The evidence suggested that he'd begun his monitoring project after discovering that government assurances about environmental safety were false. His early journals contained references to conversations with other property owners, to concerns about livestock health and crop failures, to growing suspicion that the official mining reports had understated both the scope of the operations and their environmental impact. But it was the discovery of correspondence with other families that revealed the true scope of her grandfather's project. Hidden in a waterproof container at the back of the bunker's largest filing cabinet, Ruth found letters that painted a picture of a community slowly awakening to the reality that they'd been betrayed by the very government they'd trusted to protect them. The Hendricks family had written to her grandfather in 1975, describing the death of their youngest son and asking if he'd noticed any unusual health problems among the valley's residents. The Peterson family had reached out in 1976, seeking advice about whether to continue ranching on land that might be contaminated. Letter after letter documented the growing realization that the uranium mining operations had left behind a legacy of environmental damage that affected every family in the region. Her grandfather's responses, preserved in carbon copies, showed a man struggling with the weight of knowledge that could destroy his neighbor's peace of mind while potentially saving their lives. He'd been carefully documenting evidence that could prove government negligence, but he'd also been watching families he'd known for decades face illnesses that might be connected to contamination he couldn't prevent. The most heartbreaking discovery was a letter from Maria Santos's mother, written just months before her death from blood cancer. She'd thanked Ruth's grandfather for his honesty about the radiation measurements around their property, and she'd asked him to continue his work so that other families might be warned before it was too late. "I know you're risking a lot by telling people the truth," she'd written, "but my children deserve to know what they're facing, and their children deserve better than we got." Ruth read that letter 3 times before the tears made it impossible to continue. Her grandfather had died carrying the burden of knowledge that could have saved lives, but he'd also died before finding a way to share that knowledge without destroying the community he'd been trying to protect. Now Ruth faced the same impossible choice. The evidence in the bunker was comprehensive enough to force government accountability and environmental remediation, but it was also damning enough to devastate property values, destroy local businesses, and force families to abandon homes they'd spent generations building. Yet the alternative was to allow the contamination to continue, to watch more families face the kind of tragedies that had struck the valley for decades, to let Scout and herself continue being exposed to radiation levels that posed serious long-term health risks. Ruth's decision came gradually, over the course of several sleepless nights spent walking the contaminated trails around her property. She would honor her grandfather's commitment to protecting the valley's residents, but she would do it more decisively than he'd been able to manage. The evidence would be made public, but in a way that focused on solutions rather than blame, on healing rather than recrimination. The first step was to get professional verification of her grandfather's measurements. Ruth used the contact information in his files to reach Dr. Sarah Chen, an environmental scientist at Colorado State University who specialized in radiation contamination from mining operations. Dr. Chen's response to Ruth's carefully worded inquiry was immediate and alarming. "If your measurements are accurate," Dr. Chen had said during their phone conversation, "you're describing contamination levels that pose immediate health risks to anyone living in the affected area. This isn't just an environmental concern, it's a public health emergency." Dr. Chen agreed to visit the valley within the week, bringing equipment that could provide the kind of official documentation necessary to force government action. But she also warned Ruth about the likely response from officials who'd prefer to keep the contamination secret. "You need to understand that there are people with powerful interests in keeping this information buried," Dr. Chen explained. "Mining. Companies, government agencies, local officials who've benefited from keeping property taxes low because they know the land is contaminated. They're not going to welcome an environmental scientist documenting their negligence." Ruth spent the days before Dr. Chen's arrival preparing for the possibility that her quiet mountain life was about to become very complicated. She made copies of the most important documents from her grandfather's files, storing them in a safe deposit box in Cedar Falls. She photographed the contamination maps and the most damaging correspondence, uploading the images to a secure online storage service that couldn't be easily accessed by government officials. Most importantly, she began reaching out to the families, whose stories were documented in her grandfather's correspondence. Some had moved away from the valley, but others remained, living on contaminated land and drinking contaminated water without knowing the risks they faced daily. The conversation with Maria Santos was particularly difficult. Ruth had developed genuine affection for the older woman over the years, and the knowledge that Maria's family history of cancer was likely connected to preventable contamination made the truth especially painful to share. "I wondered if something like this might be true," Maria said, when Ruth finished explaining what she'd discovered. "My mother always suspected that the mining operations had caused more damage than the government admitted. She used to say that the land itself felt different after they finished, like something essential had been poisoned." Maria's response gave Ruth the courage to continue reaching out to other families. One by one, she made contact with valley residents whose health histories matched the patterns documented in her grandfather's research. Some were skeptical, unwilling to believe that they'd been living with hidden contamination for decades. Others expressed relief that their suspicions about unusual illness patterns finally had an explanation. By the time Dr. Chen arrived for her site visit, Ruth had assembled a network of families who were ready to demand answers about the contamination that had affected their lives for generations. The quiet mountain valley was about to become the center of an environmental justice movement that would challenge decades of government, secrecy, and corporate negligence. Standing beside the pine tree where Scout had first detected the hidden bunker, Ruth felt the weight of her grandfather's legacy settling on her shoulders, like a mantle she'd inherited without choosing. But she also felt something he might not have experienced during his years of solitary documentation, the support of a community that was ready to fight for the truth, no matter how difficult that truth might be to face. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived on a Thursday morning that dawned crisp and clear. The kind of mountain day that made it difficult to believe anything sinister could be lurking beneath the valley's pristine beauty. Ruth watched from her porch as the white SUV, with Colorado State University markings, navigated the winding dirt road to her cabin, followed by a second vehicle that carried additional scientific equipment and graduate students who would assist with the comprehensive site evaluation. Ruth had spent the previous evening preparing for this moment, organizing her grandfather's most compelling evidence and rehearsing explanations that would convey the scope of the contamination without overwhelming the visiting scientists with decades of accumulated documentation. Scout seemed to sense the importance of the day, remaining closer to Ruth than usual and watching the approaching vehicles with the alert attention he typically reserved for wildlife sightings. Dr. Chen proved to be a compact woman in her 40s with the kind of direct manner that Ruth appreciated. She'd brought sophisticated radiation detection equipment that made her grandfather's vintage Geiger counter look like a museum piece, along with soil sampling tools and water testing apparatus that could provide the kind of precise measurements necessary for legal action against government agencies. Before we begin the formal testing, Dr. Chen said as her team unloaded equipment near the pine tree, "I want you to understand what we're likely to find and what it might mean for you personally." The conversation that followed was sobering in ways that Ruth hadn't fully anticipated. Dr. Chen explained that if the contamination was as extensive as Ruth's preliminary measurements suggested, the property would likely be declared uninhabitable. The well water that Ruth had been drinking for 5 years would need to be tested for radioactive isotopes that could cause cancer, birth defects, and other serious health problems. The vegetables from her garden, the air she breathed during her daily walks, even the dust that accumulated inside her cabin, all of it might contain radioactive particles that posed cumulative health risks. "I need to ask you some medical questions," Dr. Chen said gently. "Have you experienced any unusual health issues since moving here? Fatigue, respiratory problems, unusual infections, anything that might indicate radiation exposure?" Ruth found herself thinking about symptoms she'd attributed to grief, to altitude adjustment, to the normal effects of mountain living and aging, the persistent cough that developed during her second winter on the property, the unusual fatigue that had made some hiking trails feel more difficult than they should have been, the skin irritation that she'd blamed on dry mountain air and sun exposure. "There have been some things," Ruth admitted, "but I assumed they were normal for someone adjusting to this lifestyle." Dr. Chen's expression grew more serious. "We'll want to arrange for medical testing as soon as possible. Radiation exposure can cause symptoms that mimic other conditions, and early detection of any health effects is crucial for treatment planning." The formal site evaluation began with the bunker itself. Dr. Chen and her team descended into her grandfather's hidden chamber with equipment that could measure radiation levels with precision that astounded Ruth. What they found confirmed her worst fears while revealing problems she hadn't even considered. The bunker itself was contaminated, suggesting that radioactive particles had infiltrated the underground space over the decades. Her grandfather's equipment, papers, and furniture all showed elevated radiation readings. That meant Ruth had been exposing herself to additional contamination during every visit to the chamber. "Your grandfather was documenting the contamination," Dr. Chen explained as they climbed back to the surface. "But he was also inadvertently concentrating it by storing contaminated materials in an enclosed space. This bunker has become a radiation source in its own right." The testing expanded across Ruth's property with results that painted a picture of contamination more extensive than even her grandfather's maps had indicated. The well water contained uranium isotopes at levels that exceeded safe drinking standards by factors that made Dr. Chen visibly angry. The soil in Ruth's vegetable garden was so contaminated that the produce she'd been eating for 5 years should have been classified as radioactive waste. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that contamination levels had actually increased since her grandfather's final measurements. Rather than dissipating over time, radioactive materials were continuing to concentrate in certain areas, creating hotspots that posed immediate dangers to anyone who spent time near them. "This suggests that there's an ongoing source," Dr. Chen explained as she reviewed the preliminary data. "Your grandfather documented historical contamination from the mining operations, but what we're seeing now indicates that radioactive materials are still being released into the environment." The implications of that discovery sent chills through Ruth that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If contamination was ongoing rather than historical, It meant that whatever had been buried or abandoned after the mining operations was still actively poisoning the valley. Families who thought they were living in a pristine mountain environment were actually being exposed to radiation levels that would require evacuation if discovered at any government facility. Ruth spent the afternoon guiding Dr. Chen's team to the abandoned mining sites marked on her grandfather's maps. At each location, their sophisticated equipment confirmed ongoing radioactive contamination at levels that made the scientists exchange worried glances and take extensive photographs for their official report. The most alarming discovery came at a site 2 miles upstream from Ruth's cabin, where mining operations had apparently left behind contaminated materials that were gradually washing downhill with each storm. The creek that Ruth had assumed carried the purest mountain water was actually a conduit for radioactive particles that were spreading contamination throughout the entire watershed. "This is criminal negligence," Dr. Chen said, as she documented radiation readings that were hundreds of times higher than normal background levels. "Someone knew this material was here, and they chose to abandon it rather than deal with proper cleanup. Every family downstream from this site has been drinking contaminated water for 40 years. As the day progressed, Ruth found herself grappling with the realization that her mountain sanctuary was actually one of the most dangerous places she could have chosen to live. The peace and solitude that had drawn her to the property were illusions built on top of an environmental disaster that should have been front page news decades ago, but she also felt a growing sense of vindication for her grandfather's work. His careful documentation hadn't been the obsession of a lonely old man. It had been the methodical investigation of a concerned citizen who'd recognized that official assurances about environmental safety were lies, designed to protect government agencies and corporations from accountability. The conversation with Dr. Chen that evening, conducted in Ruth's kitchen over coffee that had been brewed with bottled water as a precaution, focused on next steps that would transform Ruth's quiet life into something resembling a legal and political battleground. "We have enough evidence to force immediate government action," Dr. Chen explained. "But you need to understand that means federal investigators, media attention, legal proceedings that could take years to resolve. Your property will become a Superfund site, which means you'll have to relocate while cleanup operations are conducted." Ruth looked around the kitchen that had become her refuge from the world's complications, at the windows that framed views of mountains she'd come to love, at Scout sleeping peacefully beside the wood stove. The idea of leaving this place felt like contemplating another kind of death, another fundamental loss that would require rebuilding her life around new realities. But the alternative was to remain silent while families continued to be poisoned by contamination that could be remediated if the proper resources were applied. Her grandfather had died without finding the courage to expose the truth publicly, but Ruth was still alive, still in possession of evidence that could force justice for everyone who'd been harmed by the ongoing cover-up. "What do we do first?" Ruth asked, and in making that choice, she committed herself to a path that would honor her grandfather's work while ensuring that his decades of careful documentation would finally serve the purpose for which it had been intended. The federal investigators arrived exactly 1 week after Dr. Chen filed her preliminary report with the Environmental Protection Agency, but they came with an agenda that had nothing to do with environmental protection. Ruth first noticed the black SUVs parked at the end of her access road on a grey Monday morning that felt heavy with approaching weather and unspoken threats. She'd been expecting government response to Dr. Chen's findings, but she'd imagined environmental scientists and public health officials who would begin the process of documenting contamination and planning remediation. Instead, the men who knocked on her door at 7 in the morning carried themselves with the bearing of people accustomed to intimidating citizens rather than protecting them. "Ms. Coleman, I'm Agent Williams with the Department of Energy," the lead investigator announced, displaying credentials that looked official but told Ruth nothing about his actual intentions. "We need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding your property." The conversation that followed took place in Ruth's kitchen, but it felt more like an interrogation than a discussion. Agent Williams and his partner, Agent Rodriguez, asked detailed questions about her grandfather's belongings, about when she'd discovered the bunker, about what she'd done with the information she'd found. Their questions suggested they knew far more about her grandfather's activities than they were willing to reveal. "Your grandfather was involved in sensitive government work," Agent Williams explained in a tone that managed to be both condescending and threatening. "The materials he left behind contain classified information that poses national security risks if mishandled." "Classified information about radiation contamination?" Ruth asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Information about government operations that remain sensitive decades after their completion," Agent Rodriguez replied. "We'll need to secure all materials related to your grandfather's work, including any copies you may have made." Ruth had anticipated this moment during the week since Dr. Chen's visit, and she'd prepared for it by ensuring that the most important evidence was safely beyond the reach of government agents who preferred secrecy to accountability. The copies stored in her safe deposit box, the digital files uploaded to secure servers, the correspondence she'd shared with affected families, all of it was now part of a network that couldn't be easily suppressed. "I've already shared the relevant information with environmental scientists," Ruth said carefully. "Dr. Chen from Colorado State University has everything she needs to document the contamination and begin the remediation process." The change in the agent's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. Agent Williams leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a register that made Scout lift his head from his spot beside the wood stove. "Ms. Coleman, you need to understand the seriousness of interfering with ongoing government operations. Your grandfather signed agreements that legally bound him to maintain secrecy about his activities. Those obligations extend to his family members who inherit materials related to his work. What about the legal obligations to protect public health?" Ruth asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "What about the families who've been poisoned by contamination that was never properly cleaned up?" Agent Rodriguez produced a tablet computer and showed Ruth satellite images of her property that had been taken within the last few days. The detail was remarkable. She could see Scout's water bowl beside the porch steps, could identify individual trees in the forest surrounding her cabin. But the real message of the images was unmistakable. She was being watched with resources that could track her every movement. "We're prepared to offer compensation for your cooperation," Agent Williams said, producing a document that he placed on the kitchen table. "Relocation assistance, fair market value for your property, help with finding suitable housing elsewhere. All you need to do is sign an agreement to maintain confidentiality about your grandfather's activities." Ruth looked at the document without touching it. The compensation offer was generous. More money than she'd ever possessed, enough to buy property anywhere in the country and live comfortably for the rest of her life. But it came with conditions that would ensure the contamination remained secret, that families continued to be poisoned by water and soil that should have been remediated decades ago. "And if I refuse?" Ruth asked, though she was certain she didn't want to hear the answer. "Then we'll be forced to pursue other options," Agent Rodriguez said, with the kind of smile that wasn't meant to be reassuring. "Legal action to recover classified materials, charges related to unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information, financial penalties that could consume any resources you might have for legal defense." The threats were delivered in bureaucratic language that made them sound almost reasonable. But Ruth understood exactly what was being offered: accept payment to remain silent, or face the full weight of government power applied to destroy her life and prevent her from continuing her grandfather's work. After the agents left, promising to return in 3 days for her decision, Ruth spent the afternoon walking the contaminated trails around her property with Scout, The knowledge that every step exposed them to additional radiation made the familiar landscape feel alien and dangerous. But it also strengthened her resolve to honor her grandfather's commitment to protecting the valley's residents. The phone call to Dr. Chen confirmed what Ruth had suspected. About the agent's visit, they contacted the university within hours of filing my report, Dr. Chen explained. They're claiming that any research related to your property involves classified information that requires special security clearances to access. They're trying to prevent me from publishing my findings or sharing them with other scientists. Can they do that legally? Ruth asked, though she suspected that legal authority was less important than political pressure when it came to suppressing inconvenient environmental research. They can make it extremely difficult and expensive for me to continue the work, Dr. Chen admitted. But they can't stop the scientific process entirely, especially if multiple researchers become involved and if the evidence is already in the public domain. That conversation led to Ruth's decision to accelerate the timeline for exposing the contamination. Rather than waiting for federal agencies to complete their own studies, she would work with Dr. Chen to release the evidence immediately, before government pressure could prevent the truth from reaching the families who needed to know about their exposure to radiation. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of activity as Ruth coordinated with Dr. Chen, environmental lawyers, and investigative journalists who specialized in government cover-ups. She provided copies of her grandfather's most damaging evidence to multiple organizations, ensuring that suppressing one source wouldn't prevent the story from being told. But perhaps most importantly, Ruth arranged for medical testing for herself and Scout, along with other Valley residents who were willing to document their exposure to radiation. Dr. Chen had connected her with physicians who specialized in radiation-related health effects, and the preliminary results were as disturbing as Ruth had feared. Her blood work showed cellular damage consistent with chronic radiation exposure. Scout's veterinary examination revealed early signs of the same kind of health effects that would be expected from years of living in a contaminated environment. Both of them were facing increased risks of cancer and other serious health problems that could have been prevented if the contamination had been properly addressed decades earlier. The medical evidence provided the personal motivation Ruth needed to resist the government pressure that was certain to intensify as the 3-day deadline approached. Agent Williams and Agent Rodriguez were returning on Thursday morning, expecting her signed agreement to maintain silence about her grandfather's work. Instead, they would find that Ruth had chosen to honor her grandfather's commitment to protecting the community, regardless of the personal costs the choice might entail. Standing in the bunker that evening, surrounded by evidence of 4 decades of environmental negligence, Ruth felt the weight of her grandfather's legacy settling on her shoulders like a responsibility she'd inherited, along with the contaminated property. But she also felt something her grandfather might not have experienced during his years of solitary documentation: the support of a growing network of scientists, lawyers, journalists, and affected families who were ready to fight for environmental justice. The battle to expose the truth about the valley's contamination was about to begin in earnest, and Ruth was as ready as she could be for whatever came next. The revelation came not from government agents or environmental scientists, but from Maria Santos, who appeared at Ruth's door on Tuesday evening carrying a manila envelope that would transform everything Ruth thought she understood about her grandfather's work and her own situation. "I should have told you this weeks ago," Maria said, settling into a kitchen chair with the careful movements of someone carrying a burden that had grown too heavy to bear alone. "But I promised your grandfather I'd never reveal it unless someone discovered his monitoring station. I've been watching you these past weeks, seeing you struggle with the same questions that tormented him for decades." Ruth poured coffee with hands that weren't quite steady, sensing that whatever Maria was about to reveal would change the careful plans she'd been making to expose the contamination. Scout positioned himself between the two women, his alert posture suggesting he could sense the tension that filled the kitchen like an approaching storm. "I'm not just a storekeeper, Ruth," Maria continued, opening the envelope to reveal documents that bore official seals and classification markings. "I never have been. My real name is Dr. Maria Santos, and I've been stationed in this valley since 1978 to monitor the ongoing contamination and to watch for anyone who might discover the truth about what really happened here." The identification card that Maria placed on the table showed her photograph alongside credentials from the Centers for Disease Control, along with security clearances that indicated access to information far beyond what Ruth had imagined. But it was the personnel file that accompanied the ID that revealed the scope of deception that had shaped Ruth's entire experience in the valley. "I was assigned to monitor your grandfather after he began documenting radiation levels that exceeded what the government considered acceptable for public knowledge," Maria explained. "My job was to assess whether he posed a security risk and to determine what action might be necessary to protect classified information about the mining operations." Ruth stared at the documents, trying to process the implications of learning that her trusted neighbor and friend had been a government operative whose job was to spy on her grandfather. The betrayal felt personal in a way that made it difficult to focus on the larger questions about what Maria's deception meant for everything Ruth had discovered. "You've been watching me too," Ruth said, the statement emerging as an accusation rather than a question. "Yes," Maria admitted, her voice carrying decades of guilt that Ruth was only beginning to understand. "When you inherited the property, I was tasked with ensuring that you never discovered the monitoring station. If you had started asking questions about unusual health patterns or environmental problems, I was supposed to discourage your interest or, if necessary, recommend that you be relocated away from the valley." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the old wall clock that had belonged to Ruth's grandfather. Scout whined softly, responding to tension he couldn't understand but could clearly sense. Ruth found herself thinking about all the conversations she'd had with Maria over the years, wondering which parts had been genuine friendship and which had been calculated surveillance. "But something changed," Maria continued, her voice growing stronger as she moved beyond confession towards something that might be redemption. "The longer I watched your grandfather, the more I understood that his concerns about contamination were justified. The government reports I was filing contained measurements that should have triggered immediate remediation, but nothing happened. Families continued to get sick, contamination levels continued to increase, and my superiors continued to classify everything as acceptable risk." Maria opened a second folder that contained correspondence between her and various government agencies, documenting her growing concerns about the health effects she was observing in the valley's residents. The letters painted a picture of a scientist struggling with the conflict between professional obligations and ethical responsibilities, between following orders and protecting the people she'd been sent to monitor. "By the time your grandfather died, I'd become convinced that the contamination needed to be exposed publicly," Maria said. "But I also knew that my position as a government operative made it impossible for me to be the one to reveal the truth. I'd signed security agreements that carried criminal penalties for unauthorized disclosure of classified information." "So you decided to wait for someone else to discover it," Ruth said. Beginning to understand the complexity of Maria's situation, "I decided to wait for you," Maria corrected. "Your grandfather talked about you often during our conversations. He believed that if anything happened to him before he could expose the contamination, you would be strong enough to continue his work. He made me promise that if you ever discovered the monitoring station, I would provide whatever assistance you needed to complete his mission." The revelation that her grandfather had anticipated her role in exposing the contamination sent chills through Ruth that had nothing to do with the mountain evening. The idea that her move to the mountains, her decision to remain after David's death, Even her discovery of the bunker might have been part of a plan that her grandfather had set in motion decades earlier, felt overwhelming in its implications. "There's something else," Maria said, producing a final document that bore Ruth's grandfather's handwriting. "A letter he asked me to give you if you ever found his evidence. He wrote it just months before his death, when he realized his health was failing, too rapidly for him to complete the exposure of the contamination himself." Ruth's hands shook as she unfolded the letter and began to read her grandfather's familiar script. What she found was a message that seemed to speak directly across the decades that had passed since his death. "My dear Ruth," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you've discovered the work I could never finish. I know this discovery must be overwhelming, but I also know that you possess the strength and integrity necessary to see this mission through to completion. The families of this valley have been betrayed by the very government that should protect them, and they deserve someone who will fight for the truth regardless of personal cost." The letter continued, with detailed instructions for exposing the contamination in ways that would maximize public impact while minimizing the government's ability to suppress the evidence. Her grandfather had anticipated the pressure tactics that agents like Williams and Rodriguez would employ, and he'd provided specific guidance for resisting intimidation while building legal and scientific support for environmental justice. But perhaps most importantly, the letter revealed that Ruth's grandfather had died not from natural causes, as the family had been told, but from radiation-induced cancer that he'd contracted during decades of monitoring contaminated sites. His death had been a direct result of his commitment to protecting the valley's residents, and his final wish was that Ruth would complete the work that had ultimately cost him his life. "I need you to understand," Maria said as Ruth finished reading the letter, "that I'm ready to violate my security agreements and provide official testimony about the government's knowledge of ongoing contamination. I've spent 40 years watching families suffer from preventable illnesses while filing reports that disappeared into classified files. I can't continue that deception any longer." The offer transformed Ruth's situation from a lonely battle against overwhelming government power to a partnership with someone who possessed insider knowledge of how the cover-up had been maintained for decades. Maria's scientific credentials and government access would provide credibility that Ruth's inherited evidence couldn't achieve alone. "The agents who visited you last week are part of a damage control team that's been activated whenever someone gets too close to exposing the mining operations," Maria explained. "They're not primarily concerned with national security. They're protecting government agencies and private corporations from liability for environmental crimes that would cost billions to properly remediate." "What about Dr. Chen?" Ruth asked, thinking about the environmental scientist who'd been threatened with security clearance requirements. "She's safe as long as she's working with officially sanctioned whistleblowers," Maria replied. "If I formally request protection under federal whistleblower statutes and publicly testify about the contamination, Dr. Chen's research becomes part of an official investigation rather than unauthorized disclosure of classified information." As the evening progressed, Ruth and Maria began planning a coordinated exposure of the contamination that would be far more comprehensive and legally protected than anything Ruth could have achieved alone. Maria's government contacts included environmental lawyers, investigative journalists, and congressional representatives who specialized in holding federal agencies accountable for environmental crimes. The plan they developed would simultaneously release the evidence to multiple organizations on the same day, making it impossible for government agents to suppress the story through intimidation or legal action. Ruth would provide her grandfather's documentation and her own radiation measurements, while Maria would offer official testimony about 4 decades of government knowledge and inaction. But perhaps most importantly, they would focus public attention on the ongoing health effects rather than historical blame, emphasizing the urgent need for remediation and medical care for affected families rather than punishment for past mistakes. Standing beside the window that overlooked the contaminated valley, Ruth felt the weight of her grandfather's legacy transforming from a burden into a mission that could finally serve the purpose for which he'd sacrificed his health and ultimately his life. With Maria's help, the evidence that had been buried in the bunker for decades would finally reach the families who needed to know the truth about the dangers they faced every day. The battle to expose them. Contamination would be difficult and dangerous, but Ruth was no longer fighting alone. The comprehensive evidence package that Ruth and Maria assembled over the next 5 days represented 40 years of systematic documentation of environmental crime and government cover-up. Working together in the bunker that had once been her grandfather's secret laboratory, they compiled radiation measurements, health records, correspondence with affected families, and official government documents that painted an undeniable picture of ongoing contamination and deliberate negligence. Ruth found herself working with an intensity that reminded her of the months after David's death, when focusing on concrete tasks had been the only way to navigate overwhelming circumstances. But this time, the urgency came from hope rather than grief, hope that the evidence they were preparing could finally force the accountability that her grandfather had died. Seeking Maria's insider knowledge proved invaluable in understanding how to present the evidence in ways that would maximize its impact while protecting them from the retaliation that was certain to follow. She identified journalists who specialized in environmental stories, lawyers who'd successfully challenged government agencies in contamination cases, and congressional representatives who'd built careers on holding federal departments accountable for environmental crimes. The key is simultaneous release to multiple outlets, Maria explained as they organized documents in the underground chamber that had become their war room. If we give the story to just one journalist or one congressional office, the government can pressure that organization to suppress or delay publication. But if 10 different outlets receive the evidence at the same time, suppression becomes impossible. The medical evidence added personal urgency to their academic documentation. Dr. Chen had arranged for comprehensive health screening for Ruth, Scout, and a dozen other Valley residents who'd volunteered to be tested for radiation exposure. The results, compiled in a report that would accompany the contamination evidence, showed a pattern of health effects that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Ruth's blood work revealed cellular damage consistent with chronic radiation exposure, along with early indicators of the kind of genetic changes that preceded radiation-induced cancers. Scout's veterinary examination showed similar patterns, with additional respiratory symptoms that suggested he'd been breathing radioactive particles for years. But perhaps most disturbing were the test results from families who'd lived in the valley for decades, which showed health effects that would be expected in populations exposed to radiation levels comparable to those experienced by atomic bomb survivors. This isn't just environmental contamination. Dr. Chen explained during a secure video conference that connected Ruth and Maria with environmental lawyers in Denver. This is a public health emergency that's been ignored for 40 years. The medical evidence alone should trigger immediate federal intervention, but even as they prepared their evidence for public release, Ruth found herself grappling with the personal costs of the mission she'd inherited. The contamination testing had made it clear that her mountain sanctuary was uninhabitable. She would need to relocate immediately to prevent further radiation exposure, abandoning the home that had been her refuge for 5 years. More difficult was the realization that Scout's exposure to radiation had already caused health damage that would require ongoing veterinary care and might ultimately prove fatal. The loyal companion who'd led her to the hidden bunker was paying the price for her grandfather's secret work, just as her grandfather had ultimately paid with his life. The emotional weight of those discoveries was balanced by the growing support network that Ruth and Maria had assembled. Environmental organizations across the country were coordinating their response to the evidence release. Medical professionals were preparing to provide care for affected families. Legal advocacy groups were developing strategies for forcing government accountability and corporate liability for the contamination, but perhaps most meaningful to Ruth was the response from families in the valley who'd volunteered to participate in the evidence compilation. One by one, they'd shared stories of illnesses and losses that had never made sense until the contamination was revealed. Children who died too young, adults who'd developed rare cancers, elderly relatives who'd suffered mysterious health problems, all of it connected to radiation exposure that could have been prevented if the mining cleanup had been conducted properly decades earlier. My father worked on the mining crews in the 1960s, explained Tom Whitfield, whose family had farmed in the valley for 3 generations. He died of lung cancer at 52, even though he never smoked. My mother developed thyroid problems in the 1970s that the doctors could never explain. Now I understand that they were both poisoned by work they thought was serving their country. Stories like Tom's provided the human context that would make the technical evidence meaningful to the general public. Ruth and Maria compiled testimonials from affected families alongside the scientific documentation, creating a narrative that combined personal tragedy with systemic injustice in ways that would be impossible to ignore. The coordination required for simultaneous evidence release involved dozens of people across multiple states, but it also meant that Ruth was no longer the only person who knew about the contamination. The secret that had tormented her grandfather for decades was now shared by a network of scientists, lawyers, journalists, and affected families who were all committed to exposing the truth. That support proved crucial when Agent Williams and Agent Rodriguez returned to Ruth's cabin on Thursday morning, expecting to collect her signed agreement to maintain silence about her grandfather's work. Instead, they found Ruth and Maria waiting with environmental lawyers who'd driven up from Denver specifically to witness the government's reaction to news that their cover-up was about to be exposed. Ms. Coleman, I trust you've had time to consider our offer, Agent Williams said, though his expression suggested he'd already recognized that the situation had changed significantly since his previous visit. I've decided to honor my grandfather's commitment to protecting the families of this valley, Ruth replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to set in motion. The evidence of contamination will be released to the public tomorrow morning. The transformation in the agent's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. Agent Rodriguez stepped forward with the aggressive posture of someone preparing to issue threats. But he stopped when he noticed the environmental lawyers recording the conversation, with equipment that would document any intimidation tactics for later legal proceedings. You're making a serious mistake, Agent Williams said, though his tone had shifted from confident authority to barely controlled anger. The information you're planning to release is classified for reasons that extend far beyond this local situation. You're jeopardizing national security operations that you couldn't possibly understand. The only thing we're jeopardizing is the government's ability to avoid accountability for poisoning. American families, Maria replied, speaking publicly as a government whistleblower for the first time in her 40-year career. I've spent decades filing reports that documented this contamination, and I've watched those reports disappear into classified files while people continued to die from preventable illnesses. The revelation that Maria was a government scientist who was officially testifying about the cover-up clearly caught the agents off guard. Agent Williams made phone calls that became increasingly heated as he reported to superiors who were apparently learning for the first time that their monitoring operation had been compromised by one of their own operatives. By afternoon, federal vehicles had begun arriving in the valley, not the environmental scientists and public health officials that Ruth had hoped to see, but security personnel whose mission was clearly to prevent the evidence release rather than to investigate the contamination. Helicopters circled overhead, and roadblocks appeared on the main routes leading to Ruth's property. "They're trying to isolate us," Maria observed as they watched the federal response from Ruth's kitchen window. "If they can prevent the evidence from reaching the outside world tomorrow morning, they can buy time to develop a strategy for suppressing the story." But Ruth and Maria had anticipated government efforts to prevent the evidence release. Multiple copies of the documentation had been distributed to trusted allies in different states, and secure communication systems had been established that would allow coordination even if Ruth's property was completely cut off from normal phone and internet service. "The evidence releases at 8 a.m. tomorrow regardless of what happens here," Ruth said, watching Scout's nervous reaction to the helicopter noise overhead. "We've done everything we can to ensure that the truth finally reaches the families who need to know." As evening approached, Ruth found herself thinking about her grandfather's final months, when he'd known his health was failing, but had continued his documentation work with the determination of someone who understood that time was running out. Now she faced her own deadline, with federal agents and security personnel gathering to prevent her from completing the mission he'd begun decades earlier. Standing in the bunker that evening, surrounded by evidence that represented a lifetime of careful observation and moral commitment, Ruth felt the weight of her grandfather's legacy transforming into a responsibility that extended far beyond her own circumstances. Tomorrow morning, the secret that had been buried beneath the pine tree would finally serve the purpose for which her grandfather had sacrificed his health and ultimately his life. The final battle to expose the contamination was about to begin. The morning of the evidence release began at 5 a.m. with the sound of heavy vehicles moving into position around Ruth's property. From her bedroom window, she could see federal agents establishing a perimeter that suggested they intended to prevent anyone from leaving the cabin until they could determine how to contain the information that was scheduled to reach the public in 3 hours. Ruth had spent a restless night knowing that this day would transform her quiet mountain life into something unrecognizable. But she'd also felt a sense of peace that came from understanding she was finally honoring her grandfather's commitment to protecting the valley's residents. Scout had remained close to her throughout the night, his alert posture suggesting he could sense the tension that surrounded their isolated sanctuary. Maria arrived at dawn, having walked cross-country through the forest to avoid the roadblocks that now blocked all vehicle access to Ruth's property. Her government credentials had allowed her to observe the federal response firsthand, and what she'd seen confirmed their worst fears about the lengths to which officials would go to prevent the evidence from reaching the public. They've mobilized resources that are normally reserved for terrorist threats, Maria reported as she helped Ruth prepare breakfast that might be their last meal in the cabin that had been Ruth's home for 5 years. Helicopter surveillance, communications jamming equipment, tactical teams that are trained for situations far more serious than environmental whistleblowing. But the federal response had also revealed the weakness in the government's position. The massive security operation couldn't be hidden from local residents, who were beginning to ask questions about why their peaceful valley had suddenly become the focus of such intense federal attention. News outlets were already reporting on the unusual government activity, creating exactly the kind of public scrutiny that officials had hoped to avoid. At 7 a.m., Ruth and Maria positioned themselves in the bunker with communication equipment that would allow them to coordinate the evidence release despite the jamming efforts taking place above ground. The underground chamber that had preserved her grandfather's secrets for decades would now serve as a command center for exposing those secrets to the world. The first indication that their plan was working came when Dr. Chen called from Colorado State University to confirm that environmental organizations across the country had received the contamination evidence and were preparing simultaneous press releases. The coordination they'd spent days organizing was functioning exactly as intended. Despite the federal efforts to isolate Ruth's property, the Denver Post is leading with the story on their website. Dr. Chen reported through the encrypted communication system they'd established. The headline reads, "Colorado Valley contaminated by secret uranium mining. Government cover-up documented for decades." The Associated Press is picking up the story for national distribution. Ruth felt a surge of vindication that was immediately followed by anxiety about what the government response would be once officials realized their containment efforts had failed. The security personnel surrounding her property had been deployed under the assumption that preventing Ruth from communicating would stop the evidence release. But the story was already spreading beyond their ability to control. The confirmation calls continued throughout the morning as journalists, environmental organizations, and legal advocacy groups activated their coordinated response to the evidence Ruth and Maria had provided. Each call brought news of another outlet that was preparing coverage, another organization that was demanding immediate government action, another legal challenge that was being filed to force environmental remediation. But perhaps most satisfying was the call from Tom Whitfield, the farmer whose family had been affected by radiation exposure for generations. "Ruth, the story is all over the radio," Tom reported with excitement that was audible despite the poor connection. "The reporter is reading directly from your grandfather's letters about the contamination. Families are calling each other, sharing stories they've never connected before. People are finally understanding why so many of our neighbors got sick." By 8:30, the federal agents who'd been maintaining their perimeter around Ruth's property began receiving orders that suggested their mission had fundamentally changed. Instead of preventing information from leaving the area, they were now focused on damage control and evidence preservation for what would inevitably become a major federal investigation. Agent Williams appeared at Ruth's door shortly before 9 a.m., but his demeanor had transformed from threatening authority to resigned acceptance of a situation that had moved beyond his control. "Ms. Coleman, I need to inform you that this property is now considered a federal crime scene," he announced with the tone of someone delivering news he'd rather not share. "We'll be conducting a comprehensive investigation of the contamination, which means you'll need to relocate immediately for your own safety. Will the investigation include accountability for the officials who covered up the contamination for 40 years? Ruth asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "That's above my pay grade," Agent Williams replied, with what might have been the first honest statement he'd made during their encounters. "My job now is to secure the evidence and ensure that proper environmental testing is conducted." The transformation in the government response was remarkable in its speed and completeness. Within hours of the story breaking nationally, officials who'd spent decades suppressing information about the contamination were announcing plans for comprehensive environmental assessment and remediation. Agency directors who'd never acknowledged the problem were scheduling press conferences to discuss their commitment to protecting public health, but Ruth understood that the sudden government cooperation was motivated by damage control, rather than genuine concern for environmental justice. The massive media attention had made continued cover-up impossible, but officials would still try to minimize their liability and limit the scope of accountability measures. The real victory came in the response from affected families and environmental organizations who were now armed with evidence that could force genuine remediation rather than cosmetic gestures. The documentation that Ruth's grandfather had died protecting was finally serving its intended purpose of empowering communities to demand environmental justice. Standing in the bunker that afternoon, surrounded by the equipment and papers that had documented 40 years of environmental crime, Ruth felt the weight of her grandfather's legacy transforming from a burden into a completed mission. The secret chamber would soon be sealed as part of the federal investigation, but its contents had already achieved the purpose for which her grandfather had sacrificed his health and ultimately his life. Scout sat beside her as she prepared to leave the bunker for the final time. his brown eyes reflecting understanding that their mountain sanctuary was changing into something different. The contaminated property that had been their home would become a Superfund site, requiring years of cleanup, but it would also become a symbol of what individual courage could accomplish when supported by community action and scientific integrity. The evidence release had succeeded beyond Ruth's most optimistic expectations, but she also understood that the real work was just beginning. Environmental remediation would take years to complete. Legal proceedings would continue for decades, and the health effects of 40 years of contamination would require ongoing medical care for affected families. But for the first time since discovering the hidden bunker, Ruth felt confident that the truth would not be buried again. The final message from Ruth's grandfather came in the form of a video recording that Maria had kept hidden for over a decade, waiting for the moment when Ruth would need to hear her grandfather's own words about the work he'd died protecting. The recording had been made just months before his death, when he'd realized that his health was failing too rapidly for him to complete the exposure of the contamination himself. Ruth discovered the video cassette in a waterproof container that Maria retrieved from her own home after the evidence release had succeeded. They watched it together in the cabin's main room, with Scout lying at Ruth's feet and the sound of federal investigators working outside, serving as a backdrop to her grandfather's message from across the decades. On the small television screen, Frank Morrison appeared as Ruth remembered him from her childhood, thoughtful, deliberate, and possessed of the quiet authority that came from a lifetime of doing difficult work with integrity. But this version of her grandfather also carried the weight of knowledge that had isolated him from his family and community for the final years of his life. Ruth, if you're watching this recording, it means you've found the courage to complete the work I couldn't finish, her grandfather said, his voice carrying the warmth she remembered from childhood visits. I know this discovery must have been overwhelming, but I also know that you possess the strength to see this mission through to completion. The recording continued with explanations that filled gaps in Ruth's understanding of his work and his motivations. He'd begun documenting radiation levels after noticing unusual health problems among Valley residents in the early 1970s. His government contacts had initially assured him that the mining cleanup was proceeding according to safety standards, but his own measurements had revealed that those assurances were false. I spent decades trying to find a way to expose this contamination without destroying the community I was trying to protect, her grandfather explained. Property values would collapse, families would lose their life savings, and the government would resist accountability for crimes that would cost billions to properly address. But I've come to understand that protecting people from the truth isn't the same as protecting them from harm. The most emotional part of the recording came when her grandfather spoke directly about Ruth's role in continuing his work. I've watched you grow into a woman of remarkable integrity and courage, he said, his eyes seeming to look directly at Ruth across the decades that separated them. You've faced profound loss with grace, and you found strength in solitude that most people never discover. Those qualities will serve you well in the fight that's ahead, but perhaps most meaningful was her grandfather's explanation of why he'd chosen to document the contamination rather than simply moving away from the valley. Some people might ask why I didn't just leave, why I spent my final years recording evidence of problems I couldn't solve, he said. The answer is that someone needed to witness what was happening here. Someone needed to preserve the truth for a time when it could finally be spoken. I couldn't save the families who were already being poisoned, but I could ensure that future generations would have the evidence necessary to prevent others from sharing their fate. The recording ended with her grandfather's expression of faith in Ruth's ability to honor his work while avoiding the isolation that had characterized his own final years. Don't carry this burden alone the way I did, he said, his voice growing softer with emotion. Find allies who share your commitment to protecting people from preventable harm. Trust in the power of truth to overcome the forces that profit from keeping communities ignorant about the risks they face. As the recording ended, Ruth felt a sense of completion that had been building since her first descent into the hidden bunker. Her grandfather's mission was finally accomplished, and his decades of careful documentation had achieved the purpose for which he'd sacrificed his health and ultimately his life. The federal investigation that was now underway represented the beginning of accountability that had been delayed for 40 years. Environmental scientists were conducting comprehensive contamination assessment that would guide remediation efforts. Medical professionals were providing care for affected families. Legal advocates were pursuing compensation for decades of preventable harm. But more importantly, the community of families who'd been isolated by their individual experiences of mysterious illnesses now understood that their suffering had been connected to a systematic environmental crime. The shame and confusion that had surrounded cancer clusters and unexplained health problems was being replaced by justified anger and coordinated demands for justice. Maria's transformation from government monitor to environmental advocate had provided crucial credibility for the evidence release. But it had also given her a sense of purpose that had been missing during her decades of filing. Reports that disappeared into classified files. I spent 40 years documenting problems that I was forbidden to solve. Maria reflected as they prepared to leave the cabin for relocation to uncontaminated housing. But watching you complete your grandfather, his work has reminded me why I became a scientist in the first place, to protect people from preventable harm. The community response to the contamination exposure had been remarkable in its unity and determination. Families who'd never spoken about their private health struggles were now sharing stories that revealed patterns of illness connected to radiation exposure. Property owners who'd been afraid to ask questions about environmental problems were now demanding comprehensive testing and remediation. Tom Whitfield had emerged as a community leader, organizing meetings where affected families could coordinate their response to the federal investigation and ensure that remediation efforts addressed their actual needs rather than bureaucratic requirements. Your grandfather gave us the evidence we needed to understand what happened to our families, Tom told Ruth during one of the final community meetings held at the cabin. But you gave us something even more important, proof that individuals can challenge government power and win when they're fighting for justice. Standing outside the cabin on her final evening in the valley, Ruth looked across the contaminated landscape that had been her sanctuary for 5 years. The mountain peaks still caught the last light of day in shades of gold and amber. The pine trees still whispered their ancient conversations with the wind, and the creek still carried its burden of radioactive particles toward the reservoir that supplied water to hundreds of families. But now, the hidden dangers were known, and the long process of healing could finally begin. Environmental remediation would take years to complete, and the health effects of decades of contamination would require ongoing medical attention. But the silence that had allowed the poisoning to continue had been broken, and the truth that her grandfather had died protecting would guide the community's fight for environmental justice. Scout pressed against her leg as they watched the sunset, his presence a reminder that the bonds formed during difficult times could survive even the most challenging circumstances. Tomorrow, they would begin life in temporary housing while cleanup efforts proceeded, but they would begin it with the knowledge that they'd honored her grandfather's commitment to protecting the valley's residents. The weight of inherited responsibility that had pressed on Ruth's shoulders for weeks was finally lifting, replaced by the satisfaction that came from completing a mission that had spanned generations and would benefit families for decades to come. 6 months after the evidence release that transformed a hidden environmental disaster into a national news story, Ruth stood beside the small trailer that had become her temporary home 3 miles from her contaminated property. The Environmental Protection Agency had installed modern remediation equipment that was gradually cleaning the soil and groundwater that had been poisoned for decades. But the process would take years to complete and would forever change the landscape. She'd come to love. Scout had recovered from his radiation exposure with veterinary treatment that was now covered by a federal compensation program for affected families. His energy had returned along with his appetite, and he'd adapted to their temporary housing with the resilience that had made him such a valuable companion during their years of mountain living. But the silver in his coat and the careful way he moved reminded Ruth daily of the price they'd both paid. For 5 years of unknowing exposure to contamination, the trailer overlooked the valley where environmental remediation crews worked daily to address 40 years of government negligence. Heavy equipment moved contaminated soil to secure storage facilities, while monitoring stations measured progress in reducing radiation levels to acceptable standards. The work was loud and disruptive, but it represented accountability that had been denied to previous generations of valley residents. Maria had purchased property adjacent to Ruth's temporary housing, using retirement savings and federal whistleblower compensation to remain close to the remediation project she'd helped expose. Her transformation from government operative to environmental advocate had given her a sense of purpose that had been missing during decades of filing reports that disappeared into classified files. The morning measurements show continued improvement in groundwater radiation levels, Maria reported as she joined Ruth for their daily coffee on the trailer's small deck. Dr. Chen estimates another 18 months before your original property meets federal safety standards for residential use. The relationship between Ruth and Maria had evolved from friendship built on deception to partnership grounded in shared commitment to environmental justice. Maria's insider knowledge of government operations continued to prove valuable as they monitored federal promises about remediation and compensation, ensuring that official commitments were translated into concrete action rather than bureaucratic delays. The legal proceedings that had emerged from the contamination exposure were proceeding more favorably than Ruth had dared to hope. Environmental lawyers had filed successful class action suits against government agencies and private contractors who'd been responsible for the inadequate cleanup of mining sites. The first settlements had already provided medical coverage and relocation assistance for affected families, with larger compensation awards expected as the full scope of health damages became clear. But perhaps most satisfying to Ruth was the transformation in community relationships that had resulted from shared understanding of the environmental challenges they'd all faced unknowingly. Families who'd suffered mysterious illnesses in isolation now supported each other through medical treatment and legal proceedings. Property owners who'd been afraid to ask questions about environmental problems now participated actively in monitoring remediation progress. Tom Whitfield had been elected to the county commission on a platform of environmental transparency and community health advocacy. His first initiative had been the establishment of citizen oversight committees that would ensure future mining or industrial activities couldn't proceed without comprehensive environmental assessment and community input. We learned that trusting government assurances about environmental safety isn't enough. Tom explained during a community meeting held in the trailer park that housed displaced families. Citizens need independent monitoring and the legal authority to demand accountability when official promises aren't kept. The medical monitoring program that Dr. Chen had established provided ongoing health care for Valley residents who'd been exposed to radiation. During the decades of contamination, early detection and treatment had already prevented several cases of radiation-induced cancer from progressing to advanced stages, saving lives that might have been lost if the contamination had remained hidden. Ruth's own health had stabilized with medical treatment and removal from the contaminated environment. Blood tests showed that her cellular damage was healing, and her prognosis for avoiding long-term health effects was encouraging as long as she continued regular monitoring and avoided further radiation exposure. The phone calls from her sister Linda had become weekly, conversations that strengthened family bonds that had been weakened by years of separation and unspoken questions about their grandfather's life. Linda had visited twice since the contamination exposure, bringing her children to meet the aunt who'd become a minor celebrity for environmental advocacy. "I'm proud of what you accomplished," Linda had said during her most recent visit. "But I'm also grateful that you're safe and that the worst of the danger is behind you." The national attention that had initially felt overwhelming had evolved into ongoing opportunities to speak about environmental justice at conferences and community meetings across the country. Ruth had discovered that her story resonated with people in many regions who suspected that their own communities might be facing hidden environmental threats from past industrial activities. The most important lesson from our experience, Ruth had told audiences at environmental conferences, is that individuals can challenge powerful institutions and win when they're fighting to protect people from preventable harm. But they don't have to fight alone. Building coalitions of affected families, supportive scientists, and committed lawyers makes the difference between martyrdom and victory. The bunker that had preserved her grandfather's evidence for decades had been sealed as part of the federal investigation, but not before Ruth had been allowed to retrieve personal items that connected her to his memory. His journals, his photographs, and the letter he'd written for her were now preserved in her temporary home, reminders of the integrity and persistence that had made her own actions possible. Standing in the valley that was slowly healing from decades of environmental damage, Ruth felt the profound satisfaction that came from honoring a legacy of service while creating something meaningful from personal loss. Her grandfather's mission had been completed, but it had also evolved into ongoing work that would benefit communities far beyond. The Colorado mountains where it had begun, Scout, appeared beside her as the afternoon light painted the remediation site in shades of gold that reminded Ruth of the sunset she'd watched from her contaminated cabin. His tail wagged with the contentment of a dog who'd found his place in a world that had become safer through the courage of people who'd refused to accept preventable harm as inevitable. The temporary trailer wasn't the mountain sanctuary that Ruth had lost, but it was home to work that mattered in ways that her previous solitude had never achieved. She traded isolation for community, grief for purpose, and helplessness for the knowledge that individual action could create positive change, even in the face of overwhelming institutional power. The valley would eventually heal from the contamination that had poisoned it for decades. Families would return to land that had been made safe through proper remediation. Children would grow up in communities where environmental threats were monitored and addressed rather than hidden and ignored. But most importantly, the example of successful environmental advocacy would inspire similar actions in other communities facing their own hidden dangers. Ruth's grandfather had died, believing that someone would eventually continue his work. And he'd been right, but his legacy had grown beyond his most optimistic expectations into a model for environmental justice that would protect families for generations to come. As the sun set over the healing valley, Ruth felt the deep peace that came from understanding that some solitude was chosen for its own sake, while other solitude was endured in service of purposes larger than personal comfort. She'd experienced both kinds, and she'd learned that the most meaningful peace came from using whatever strength and resources she possessed to protect people from preventable harm. The mountain sanctuary had been lost, but the mission it had preserved would continue long after the last traces of contamination had been removed from the Colorado soil where her grandfather had chosen to make his stand for environmental justice and community protection.